Hello, friends, and welcome to a Chabura public shiur. Tonight we have with us Rabbi Shmuel Phillips, who is no stranger to the Chabura, and together we will be exploring Sepharadi and Ashkenazi Talmudic methodologies, a highly requested topic. This is the first installment of a two-part series, with part 2 taking place on the 17th, Bezrat Hashem. Yeah, for the new faces, welcome. The Chabura is an online and global Bet Midrash. We have a full program with regular weekly shiurim across a wide array of topics given by dayanim, rabbis, and leading experts from around the world. We host live events and have a publishing house which puts out our journal principles and a wide array of cutting-edge books. So I highly recommend you check us out at the Chabura, and we hope you can join us. About our speaker, Rav Shmuel is the author of the highly acclaimed Judaism Reclaimed, and now the newly published Talmud Reclaimed, which I'm currently reading. I highly recommend getting yourself a copy. Rav Shmuel spent over 2 decades studying in yeshiva and teaching in a variety of institutions. During this time, he has also completed a law degree from the University of London. With that said, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us live, and thank you all who will be listening after. Rav, thank you so much for being with us. It's always a privilege to learn from you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. To wish everyone a good evening, Chodesh Tov. For those of you, it's Rosh Chodesh for some of us. So yes, if I speak for long enough, it'll be Rosh Chodesh for everyone. So one of the questions I get, really quite often about my book is, why am I calling it Reclaimed? What am I trying to reclaim? Judaism reclaimed, Talmud reclaimed. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to reinvent something. So aside from it being like a good, catchy title, that's not really the answer that people want to hear. Very often I find that there are certain really fundamental ideas, core ideas, which people really need to be aware of when studying various aspects of Judaism, which have really gone missing, particularly in recent generations. That was the case in Judaism Reclaimed. I tried to bring back some of the main ideas of Rambam, of Shimshon Raphael Harsh, into more mainstream Jewish areas of discussion. And with this Talmud Reclaimed, I try and do the same. And the first half of the book, which I'm not going to be discussing tonight, that talks about how the different parts of the oral tradition, some of it is immutable, some of it is Mis Sinai, some of it's from Moshe, some of it can never change, can only be subject to machloket. But there's a lot of it that can. A lot of it that is supposed to be able to be debated and defined and changed from generation to generation by the Chachamim, by the Sanhedrin, and that is something which people just aren't really aware of. And the second part of the book, which I'm going to be discussing this evening, is really the same thing: understanding the vastly diverging methodologies employed by Rishonim, by the classic medieval commentators and interpreters of the Talmud. These are in standard shiurim in yeshivot today. If we think of a standard Gemara share, you get the sugya of Gemara, which is sort of read very, very quickly, if at all, and you have the Maggid Shir will go through the set of the standard, the fashionable, the standard Rishonim, and they'll put them all together as if they're using one simple methodology in debate with one another, even though they were living in from France to Germany to Spain to North Africa, very different places over several hundred years, and they're all understood or imagined to be in some kind of conversation with each other in interpreting the Gemara. And the job of the Maggid Shir is often to try and pull together all these different Rishonim, from the Tosfot to the Rambam, the Rashi, the Rosh, the Ramban, bring them all together into a conversation and weave together some kind of intricate web to show how they were really on the same wavelength, and there was normally some minor matter in which they disagreed upon. And what I try to reclaim really in this book is something which, if we're going to see this more in the follow-up share next week, some of which the earlier commentators, the earlier Achronim, were well aware of, which is that the Rishonim employed fundamentally different methodologies. Their perception of the Talmud, the way they went about studying the Talmud and determining law from the Talmud, was vastly different from one another. And when this is glossed over particularly in contemporary yeshiva study, particularly with the brisk methodology that's going to be more subject to next week. The true flavor, the true meaning of these Rishonim, it tends to be lost, and to some extent, really misunderstood. So what I'm going to be looking at this week, to start with, is just panning out what these different methodologies are. I'm going to take as the two polar examples, the methodologies of Rambam, Rif, and the Geonim on the one side, and the methodology of the Balei Tosafot on the other side. There were many Rishonim who fell somewhere between the two of them, particularly in the northern Spain or southern France, where the communities converged somewhat, and there were some Rishonim that took on aspects of both. But in order to demonstrate the differences we have between these methodologies, between that of the Tosafot and that of Rambam, I'm going to be comparing some descriptions and some understanding of the methodologies, and then just giving some practical examples to show how differently they went about interpreting the sugyot and how that's impacted on the way they went about determining the final halachot. If anyone's got any questions at any time, you can raise a question. There will definitely be time for questions at the end. Next week is going to take one big sugya, one striking sugya, which I hope will demonstrate all of these points very, very clearly. The difference between the Tosafot and the Rambam, how it had enormous halachic ramifications, enormous divergences in how they approach their method of study, and showing how the modern yeshiva world sometimes will try to read Rambam as if he were a Tosafist and project, so to speak, Tosafist thinking onto the Rambam in a way which the early commentaries of the Rambam would never have considered viable or possible. So that's enough of an introduction for now. I'm going to try sharing the screen again. It worked a minute ago. Excellent. So, can everyone see it?
Yes.
Thumbs up? Yeah, okay, great. So the question that comes up is, how did the Rishonim go about analyzing and determining law from the Talmud? How did they get the halacha from the Gemara? And one aspect that I'm not going to go into this evening, which is one big source of difference between Rambam and the Tosafot, is whether the extent to which it is legitimate to take halachot as they appear in the Gemara and say, well, that was understood, that was justified, that made sense, that was relevant at the time of the Gemara where certain social settings or certain things were understood, but nowadays things are different, and therefore we are permitted, we are perhaps obligated to amend the law. So whether things like clapping and dancing on Shabbat, because that gezerah may not be relevant, whether it's a matter of changing the time of lighting Hanukkah candles because people travel back home at a different time. There are many examples of that. And again, the Rambam, the Rif, is normally stricter about this. The Balei Tosafot are much more willing, much more flexible. They're more willing to bring in svara. That is linked to what we're discussing this evening, but I'm not going to go into that so much. I discussed that more in the previous interview I had with Sina. This evening, we're going to be looking at a different phenomenon, which is multiple sugyot. When you have one topic, one area of discussion, which is treated not just in one sugya, but perhaps in 3, 4, 5 different sugyot in different areas of Shas. Should we be attempting to try and unify all these disparate voices of the Talmud, put them together to try and maximize and bring in as many strands of Talmudic wisdom, so to speak, as we can within our legal ruling? Or should we try to identify the primary voice? Who is the main speaker within the Talmud, and rule like that person, that Rav? And as we're going to see, this is a major source of divergence in the methodologies of Rambam and Rif on the one hand, with the Gaonim, and the Balei Tosafot on the other. So we're going to start with, it's a bit of a teasing source, this one, is the introduction to Moreh Nevuchim, the famous contradictions that there are. And these are normally brought up for a different reason, but here we're looking at the first contradiction. The Rambam lists just before he starts Moreh Nevuchim, he lists 7 different types of contradictions that may be found within various works and the different reasons for them. One moment. And he tries to give examples of each one. And the first type of contradiction that he brings is where the author, I'm reading now from the first source, the author has collected remarks of various people with different opinions, but he's omitted the citation of his authorities. Contradictions can be found in such statements because one of two propositions is the opinion of one individual, while the other proposition is the opinion of another individual. And so what we see here is the fact that you have an apparent contradiction within one work, but really it's not a contradiction, because this is just a likut. It is a collection of different statements of different people, different rabbis in this case, and for whatever reason, the identities have not been recorded. And the Rambam continues towards the end of this section by saying the contradictions and divergences that are to be found in the Talmud are due to this first cause and the second, which we'll leave out for now. Thus you find them saying constantly, in this matter he agreed with this rabbi, and in that with another rabbi. One of the ways that the Gemara resolves apparent contradictions sometimes is by saying that a certain rabbi or a certain Gemara was of a split opinion. And therefore, the Rambam is not encouraging us to try and reconcile these different opinions. Rambam is saying straight out at the beginning that the Talmud is a collection of many, dozens, hundreds of different rabbis who were present in the Amoraic Bet Midrash, and it has many different opinions. And if you try to pull them together and combine them, you may end up with none of the opinions at all. That's source one. Source two, Yad Malachi, which is an excellent book of Klalim of the Talmud. It goes to the Klalim of the Talmud, of the Rambam, the Rif, and this is a very short klal. He writes, Derech HaRambam, the Kol Makom sheyesh shnei svarot hafachiyot. The way of the Rambam is that any time you have two opposing opinions in the Talmud, or Pasag Talmudak echad minayu, and he understands that the Talmud has determined that the halacha should follow opinion A, by saying that we are posek like opinion A, that means we're entirely removed from consideration opinion B and source B. We're not trying to bring it back on board. We're not trying to reconcile it. It is now irrelevant to our discussion. We have identified that source A, opinion A, for whatever reason, however we've identified it, is the halacha, and we're negating the input in terms of halacha of any other opinions which seem to counter it. Where does all this come from? Is it Rambam's own approach? Well, source 3 here, if we scroll down a bit, you can see it. Actually, you're watching the same screen as me. So this is a quote from Rabbeinu Hananel's commentary to Baba Batra 52a. And he's quoting, a few lines down, he's quoting this piece in the name of Rav Hai Gon, who's one of the last of the Gaonim of Bavel. Rav Hai Gon himself is quoting from his own teachers. So I don't know how many generations this goes back, but it's Rav Hai Gon quoting from his own teachers, presumably other Gaonim who preceded him. And he's giving a list of different klalim, a list of different rules. And he starts off by saying a rule about where anytime the word tiyuvta is used, okay, he goes on with this. But now if we go down to, I can show you the mouse for a minute, to here, this square bracket, this is the crucial lines. That is, let's say you have two different Talmudic passages whose reasons appear to contradict one another. This is a standard fare for a commentary of Tosfos, or a standard fare for a contemporary yeshiva shir. You have two sugyot, and the conclusions of each seem to be in opposition to one another. So what does Rav Hai Gon say in the name of his teachers? Where the reasons of these two sources are in contradiction with one another. And the Talmud itself does not offer a resolution to this question of dinon ki habaduchta v'ki habaduchta. We are posek the halacha, even though it is a contradictory psak, we are posek halacha A one way, mutar, and halacha B the other way, asur. We do not concern ourselves. We do not concern ourselves with trying to find a reason to reconcile them. The more common methodology nowadays, as we're going to see, is when you have some sort of contradiction, you assume that there must be some kind of information, some sort of a kimta, some kind of extra logical way of reconciling that we don't have available, and we speculate to try and reconcile them, and we create halacha on that basis. The way that Rav Hai Gon is quoting from his Rabbi, as we're going to see, this is also the way of Rambam, Rav Avram ben Rambam, that no, when you have two contradictory sources, and there's no way of there's no apparent way from the Gemara itself of reconciling them, you're posek each sugya as it appears to be, and you do not concern yourself with trying to reconcile them. Now, in opposition to that we've seen the tradition outlined of the Rambam and the Geonim of isolating different opinions within the Talmud, different sugyot within the Talmud, and at least where it comes to determining the halacha from the Talmud, we do not concern ourselves with, or we don't qualify ourselves, give ourselves the authority of reconciling them and trying to bring both sources on board. If you look now at the next source, now we switch over to looking at the Balei Tosafot, and what is interesting is the Maharshal in his Yom Shel Shlomo, his commentary on the Gemara, is his introduction to Baba Kama. The Maharshal was a staunch advocate, a passionate advocate and supporter of everything Ashkenaz and the Balei Tosafot and all Ashkenazi minhagim, and he fought fiercely for his authority. It came out, actually, in some ways, it's some people here will find interesting. He also opposed very much some of the halachic rulings of the Shulchan Aruch, which came from Kabbalah, which were claimed from the Rishon Ben Yochai, because that was not part of the Ashkenazi Masorah. And he said a very powerfully written response to the Shulchan Aruch when it's a sugya about whether tefillin should be worn on Chol HaMoed. He said, even you're claiming that from the Zohar of Rishon Ben Yochai that tefillin should not be worn on Chol HaMoed. Well, even if Rishon Ben Yochai walked into our Bet Midrash here in France, or was it Poland by then, and told us you should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, we still would not listen to him, because we are posek according to our Gemara, according to our sages how they've interpreted it. So that's just that he's a staunch advocate of everything Ashkenaz, and he's a big supporter of the Balei Tosafot. So here, what he writes is he's actually praising the Balei Tosafot. He's not what he's writing here is not attempting to denigrate them at all. He's praising them, and he's describing what great things they've done, the revolution that the Tosafot have brought about with their methodology. So bring the mouse along here, the middle paragraph. V'nachzor l'rishonot, the HaTalmud asher anu oskim bar, this is the Talmud that we are involved in, u'mimenu anu shotim, and it's from that we drink. Lulei chachmei Tzarfatim Balei Tosafot. Were it not for the great wisdom of the French Balei Tosafot, shesa'uhu oisoi k'kador echad, they turned the whole Talmud into one kador, into one ball. So what did the Balei Tosafot do? They turned what was a flat work, a spread out work of many different opinions. They turned it all into one kador. They fixed and they combined the whole Talmud together. Meaning the impression being that previously we had all these different disparate statements and rulings and teachings in the Talmud and halacha, and we didn't know how to reconcile them all. The Chachmei Tzarfatim Balei Tosafot took all these different statements and showed us how to reconcile them. So we no longer have to rule only like one and dismiss the others. We can now combine them all into one ball, which goes round and round and round, and nothing is dismissed. Everything is a valid source of halacha. And we're now going to look at some more recent, some more academic descriptions of these two methodologies before going to some examples of how this plays out in practical halacha. So what we have here is a quote from Professor Chaim Soloveitchik in his a short essay called "The Printed Page of the Talmud," and he's describing the again, it's similar to the Maharshal, but in different sorts of words, the revolution and the great difference that was made that was introduced really by the Ba'alei Tosafot, and how they changed what had been the approach to studying Talmud and to determining halacha from the Talmud up until that time. So it's not that the Tosafists were the first to note contradictions in the Talmud. Contradictions had been noted from the moment that the Talmud became normative. Everyone could look at the Talmud and see as to why there are contradictions, whether they finish editing it, whether it was intended to be a document without a work without contradictions. Putting that aside, but how did we deal with these contradictions? That's the big question. So the approach that had previously prevailed was to follow, in cases of contradiction, the sugya deshmaitza, the dominant discussion. This is what we saw above with the Rambam. You're posek like one sugya deshmaitza. You identify the primary sugya, and you dismiss the others. And that's how you're posek. There's generally one major treatment of an issue in the Talmud, though that issue may reappear in the course of many other discussions. When confronted with a contradiction, one should follow the conclusions of the dominant discussion, even if other Talmudic discussions of the problem would seem to imply a different outcome. We're going to see some very clear examples of this coming up. So up until the Ba'alei Tosafot, they would take the primary major treatment of a halachic issue and follow its conclusions, and not be concerned with tangential Talmudic discussions which seem to imply differently. However, the premise of the dialectic, which is what he's just using to describe the Tosafot, the premise of dialectic, however, is that there are no major and minor passages in the corpus. They reject the whole idea of there being a sugya d'shmaitza, a primary voice that we listen to and ignore the others. All passages are of equal valence. I love that word. The Talmud in its totality is a harmonious whole. Talmudic discussions are indeed telegrammatic, and thus, through certain conditions of the case at bar, though certain conditions of the case at bar are not always expressly spelled out, they are inferable from the discussion. And the task of the scholar, this is the methodology of Tosafot, which has become dominant in the yeshiva world since. One is the task of a Talmudic scholar to ferret out the distinctiveness of each of the seemingly similar cases under discussion, and thereby restore harmony to an apparently dissonant corpus. So this could not be more different in terms of methodology. The Rambam, the Rif, the Gaonim that we've seen, tells you to look at each sugya, each passage in isolation. You're posek like each one in its place. You don't try to reconcile them. When there are multiple passages which deal with the same points, you identify the primary passage and you delete from considerations all other inferences from the Talmud, from all other passages. The Tosafot tell you no, there's no major minor passages. Everything is combined together. Everything is kadur echad. Everything is one ball. You got no right, no ability to identify and dismiss minor voices. And if you're a better scholar you are, the more innovative ways you'll come up with, finding out ways of reconciling kimtas, and this sugya was only meant in this condition, and that sugya was meant in that condition. And for those familiar with the discussions of the Tosafot, the Rishas, this is the 60-70% of the Tosafot follow this sort of pattern. Contradiction between sugyot. No, this sugya applies under scenario A, and this other sugya applies under scenario B. Now, this is another, one second, this is the Netziv, who is another Ashkenazi source identifying the different methodologies of Tosafot and Rambam and the Gaonim. And he does it, he's looking at it in terms of the Masorah, the tradition that they received. What's particularly interesting here is that the Netziv was a Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. Volozhin was one of the flagship Ashkenazi European yeshivas in Lithuania before the war. And the Netziv Listen to what he writes. He says, "V'hageonim shebo achrei chachmei Bavel mechavei Talmud." So the Gaonim who came after the compilers of the Talmud, Yodu kama shvilim pshutim b'zeh paltrin. They knew many simple paths to navigate this paltrin as a palace. I think they could. It's referring to the Talmud, and it's many. It's some kind of maze, different roads, different ways of going through it. The Gaonim had a tradition, the Masorah, the Kabbalah, of how to navigate simply through these paths. This caused them not to have many doubts in terms of halacha. This meant that at least when it came to determining halacha, they did not need to resort to koach hapilpul. They didn't have to innovate and have to come up with different principles and different contexts and conditions for the various Talmudic discussion, because they had a simple path and Masorah through which to understand and determine halacha from the Talmud. However, Gala Kavod Torah mi Bavel Medinat Sarfat. When the Kavod Torah, when there was a bunch of persecution and exile, and the Kavod Torah ended up being exiled to Sarfat, to France, Eretz lo ra'u ora Kabbalah Sudura. They didn't receive their tradition from Bavel in an organized way. It was there definitely is some kind of Masorah. There is that you find the Balei Tosfot, the Rashi, quoting sources from the Gaonim, but it wasn't received in a direct way. They didn't have the same language. They weren't in contact so much, and through the generations, it was a Kabbalah which was not Sudura, and therefore they didn't have the same Kabbalah of how to approach the Sugyot according to the Netziv. So they had to compensate for their lack of their lack of Kabbalah, their lack of knowledge of how to navigate the palace through Iyun and Chakira, through study and Chakira, meaning investigation and trying to understand. Yagu umotzu shvil chadash kechamabara. Again, the Netziv isn't criticizing this. He sees this as something positive as well. Meaning you've got the Kabbalah aspect from the Gaonim, and you've got the creativity from the Balei Tosfot, and these are all parts of the Torah that we learn. And the Netziv is, what's interesting is just seeing how the Netziv brings out both of these aspects. The tradition, as it was received, apparently a simple tradition of the Gaonim, and a more complex, creative, innovative tradition of the Balei Tosfot, which, as we've seen, will pull together different sources to try and create new understanding of Sugyot. And he goes on to say the Ramban is also somewhere between the two. And he finishes over here by saying, Loken Rishon Lara Rambam Oragola Hulamad Mirabo Me'aviv Rabbeinu Maimon. So he learned the tradition from his father. V'hari Megash Kabbalat Gaonim V'Gursasem Mila B'Mila. So he's really saying that the tradition of the Rambam is like that of the Gaonim. He had a simple path through the Sugyot, which seems to be how to identify the Sugya Deshmaita, the primary passage, and then rule like it. And therefore, he was not part of the tradition of Eretz Tzarfat, who did not have the Kabbalah Sudura, didn't have the ordered tradition from the Gaonim, and therefore we were Hutzuchi, they were forced to use Yin and Chakira. So that's coming from the Netziv, who was a Rosh Yeshiva of one of the flagship yeshivas in Lithuania of Volozhin. So a question often comes up that how can we suggest that the Rambam, the Rif, the Gaonim, how can we justify the methodology of the Rambam of ignoring dialectics, ignoring okimtas, ignoring this sort of analysis? Surely the Amoraim themselves use this sort of dialectic methodology, this sort of pilpul, these okimtas, when they're analyzing the Mishnah. And later Amoraim use the same methodology of pilpul, of okimtas, when they were analyzing the opinions of earlier Amoraim. You find them very often trying to contextualize and bring together earlier opinions. And there are a couple of opinions here of scholars here who make this very point. The Tosafot, Ephraim Orbach said, the Tosafists availed themselves of the particular interpretive methods and techniques of the Amoraim, the same logical analogies. Each Talmudic statement was subject to vigorous examination, meaning what he's saying is that the Tosafot really were continuing the process of the Gemara. What the Stamad Gemara or the later Amoraim did to the early Amoraim, and what the Amoraim all did to the Mishnah of taking different opinions and trying to analyze them and put them in context, that's exactly what Tosafot were doing to the Gemara. They didn't innovate any new methods. They were just trying to continue. Again, later schools like Brisk and other schools did come up with new methodologies, but Tosafot themselves were using Talmudic methodologies to analyze the Talmud. So wouldn't the rabbis in the Talmud have expected their own words to have been dealt with in the same way as they dealt with the words of their predecessors? So if all Tosafot were doing was continuing the work of the Talmud, why would the Rambam and the Rif and the Gaonim not have chosen to do exactly the same thing? Why is it that no prior Rishon, as far as we can see, none of the Gaonim appeared to have adopted this methodology of the Tosafot? So this is something which I look at also in this chapter 6 of my new book, Talmud Reclaimed. Because one question is it a correct methodology? And the other is, are you authorized to use such a methodology? There's a big elephant in the room, really, which is hanging over all of the Rishonim, all of the medieval scholars, which is that Ravina Ravashi Sof Hara'ah. There's this principle which they all accept to more or lesser extent. They apply it in different ways, but all Rishonim accept the idea that Hara'ah, Chidushei Halacha, new legal rulings, could not be issued after the time of the sealing of the Talmud, Ravina and Ravashi. So when you come along and you take two earlier opinions of the Amoraim, and instead of reading them at face value, you use your own svara to say, well, this one doesn't fit with that one. Statement A does not fit with statement B, so therefore what am I going to do? I'm going to come up with this great idea to try and reconcile them and say statement A only applies in this scenario, statement B applies in other scenarios. So it could very well be that Rambam and the Gaonim would view that as a form of Hora'ah, because that resolution is not in the Gemara. So what you're essentially doing is you are projecting, you're imposing your own ideas, your own resolution onto the words of the Amoraim, and you're using that to create essentially a new halacha, which isn't written in the Talmud. So if you have a very strict idea of how determining law of the Talmud should work, like it seems to be the Rambam and the Gaonim had, then if you try to impose ideas and make a kimtas, we're going to look at some examples in just a minute, then you may be stepping over the red line of Sof Hara'ah. You cannot innovate. So you don't have Sanhedrin, you don't have Beis Nagadol, you cannot innovate. The Tosafot may have thought, no, this is just the way that law is interpreted. Any legal interpretation, any way of reading any law has some subjective input by the judge. Anytime a judge is looking at a precedent or is interpreting a statute, some kind of basic logic has to come into it. And this is to an extent that, again, I also go through in the chapter, there was a major dispute in jurisprudence, legal philosophy, throughout the 20th century between the legal positivists, who believed in a very strict methodology sorry, for interpreting law, and then others such as Dworkin, who believe no, there's no such thing as strictly interpreting law, because any time you try to interpret law, you're essentially having to add to it and having to contextualize it. So again, I'm not going to go into this now, but I believe that there are two very different legal methodologies at play. And there's also the fact that the Rambam and the Gaonim seem to possess this Kabbalah, this tradition of how to isolate and choose between different opinions in order to determine simply the halacha from the Talmud. Whereas, according to the Netziv, Tosfot did not have such a Kabbalah, did not have such a tradition in a Masudar way, in a clear, transparent way. So that is the theory. Now we're going to have a look at some examples of how this is played out. So the first example is going to look the first one's only going to look at the Rambam, and then we're going to look at some examples which contrast Rambam and the Baalei Tosfot. So it's a very big sugya which is often talked about mitzvot tzrichat kavanah. When you perform a mitzvah, but you're not really thinking about what you're doing, have you fulfilled the mitzvah or not? And why is it a big sugya, as much talked about? Because the basic case law seems to be contradictory. And we're going to bring a couple of there are many different cases. We'll just bring a couple here from Mishnah Torah. Hilchot Shofar, chapter 2, halacha 4. Hamitasek b'tkiyat shofar litlamed lo yatzai yedei chavato. So if you are it's a Rosh Hashanah, you're standing around in the streets, you're practicing the shofar, and you're teaching it, you're practicing it. Lo yatzai yedei chavato. You're not having anything in your mind about performing a mitzvah. You're just practicing. You're fooling around with the shofar. No, not good enough. You haven't had any kavanah there, and therefore you're not yatzah. V'kein hashomer min mitasek lo yatzah. So he carries on a few different examples of this in this halacha. The rule seems to be, if you do not have kavanah that you're performing a mitzvah, you just blowing the shofar absent-mindedly, you're not yatzah. However, we look at Hilchot Chametz Matzah, Achal Matzah below kavanah. If you eat matzah leil seder without any kind of intention that you're performing a mitzvah, even if you're forced against your will, someone puts a gun to your head and says, eat matzah, and you eat the matzah against your own will, you still fulfill the mitzvah. And there are many other cases. There's Megillah, there's Mikvah, there's plenty of other cases here, but we're not going to go through all of them. But the classic commentaries, all of a field day on this, trying to reconcile the different rulings of the Rambam. How is it the Rambam rules in some places it seems that mitzvahs do require kavanah? If you don't have kavanah, you're not yotze, you're chiyuv. And in other cases, seems to say, no, you don't have to have kavanah at all. So Rambam's contradicting himself. It must be there's some sort of clever resolution here that we can use to reconcile them. Maggid Mishnah, who's giving quite an early commentary on the Rambam, he says no, he can't find any reconciliation which he's satisfied with, and he assumes that there's a corrupt girsa there, and he leaves it at that, which is actually interesting because some commentaries will actually go and amend the girsa on their own steam. Maggid Mishnah just says he can't find any way to reconcile these. He assumes there's some sort of corrupted girsa, and he leaves it at that. Now look at the words of Rav Avram and Rambam, Rambam's own son, who studied with the Rambam, how he understood his father's methodology. This is I've lost the reference here. It's in I think it's Simon 34 of his Shavot. So v'afal pi, the mouse over here. Afal pi shezeh shama v'zeh shama. Zeh kiven et libo, zeh lo kiven et libo. So here he's contrasting the laws about hearing shofar and Megillah. Shofar, if you don't have kavanah, you're not yotzah. Megillah, you do. Megillah, 1 second. Hilchot b'shofar Megillah tzrichen kavanah letzeis kedukya demasnisin. When it comes to shofar and Megillah, it arises that you do need to have kavanah in order to fulfill the mitzvah. V'kriyat shema v'chilat matzah t'vilat mei mikvah, reciting shema, eating matzah and tevilah mei mikvah, to see exactly what that case is. Lo b'inan kavanah letzeis. The mitzvah ain't tzrichat kavanah. So the first set of cases, we see a series of cases from the Rambam says the mitzvah do need kavanah, and a second series of cases where we see the Rambam rules the mitzvah do not need kavanah. How do we put this together? Well, according to Avram and Rambam, the sugya to Gemara b'chol duchta v'duchta. This goes according to the sugya in each different case. V'i kashelach, and if you got a question on my father's Mishnah Torah, my shnash shofar Megillah mishar mitzvot. What is the difference between shofar Megillah on the one hand, where you have to have kavanah from the other mitzvot? Zuvadai kushyamuka. This is certainly a deep valid, legitimate question. V'yala Gemara, lo ala b'mari. This question is one that you should address to the Gemara, not to my father. Meaning, my father, the Rambam, was just involved with identifying each halacha, what the conclusion was, and writing it down in the Mishnah Torah. He doesn't try to reconcile them and bring in his own innovations. Whereas we can imagine many of the other commentaries through the years have tried to come up with different reasons to distinguish and differentiate between these different mitzvot and rule differently on that basis. Now we come to an example where we contrast the rulings of Rambam and the Tosfot. It's a question over the reciting of bracha on tefillin. So as we know, that there's a difference in practice. Sephardim will generally say one bracha, laniach tefillin, when they put on the tefillin on the arm, and that will cover the tefillin shel yad and the tefillin shel rosh. Whereas Ashkenazim, I don't know if it's a complete Sephardi Ashkenazi divide here, but Ashkenazim, from what I can tell, will say two brachot. Sephardim will say one bracha. Ashkenazim will say laniach on the yad and mitzvah tefillin on the rosh, and Sephardim will say just laniach on both. So now, if we have a look at it, there's actually a story of two different sugyot of the Gemara. So we start off here with brachot. So this is a list on brachot daf samach of a whole list of different brachas that you say for different things you do in the morning. And in passing, the Gemara says, Kimanach tefillin adorei, when you place a tefillin on your arm, Leima baruch asher kishon b'sasav v'tzivanu laniach tefillin. Areishe, when you put the tefillin on your head, Leima baruch asher kishon b'sasav v'tzivanu al mitzvat tefillin. So this seems to be in accordance with the Ashkenazi practice. However, we have another sugya from Masechet Menachot, which I would say we're going to see is a whole sugya. This is the primary sugya where the laws of tefillin are situated. So this would be the sugya de Shemaitza. And we have differences of opinion here. Omar of Chista. Sach bein tefillah tefillah, chozer mevarech. If you make a hefsek, if you speak between putting on one tefillin and the other tefillin, you have to go back and make a new bracha. See what that means? Sach in, lo sach lo. Only if you interrupt, you have to make a second bracha. But in a normal situation, you'd only make one bracha. So this would seem to accord with the Sephardi approach of only making one bracha on tefillin. But do we not have a report in the name of Rabbi Yochanan? Do we not say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that there's one bracha that's said on the shel yad, which is laniach, al tefillin shel rosh al baruch al mitzvot tefillin? So the Gemara objects. Do we not have another report from the Rabbi Yochanan that's really you should say two brachot, one on each of the tefillin? The Gemara doesn't say anything back to that. But then we have the latter opinions of Abai and Rava, who are the Batroi, the final opinion. The Amrit Harvayu, they both agree. Lo sach mavarech achat, sach mavarech shtayim. They seem to uphold the original tradition of Rav Chista that in a normal situation, a regular situation where there are no interruptions, only one bracha is made. So what we have here is you have the sugya in brachot that says straight out that there are two brachot made for tefillin, one on each. And then you have the sugya in menachot, which seems to be the sugya de Shemaitza. So it spends many pages talking about tefillin there, where it seems to be a difference of opinion, but the latter opinion of the Batroi, halacha the Batroi, the latter opinion that we normally follow la halacha of the sugya de Shemaitza is you say one bracha. And sure enough, if we go down to the Rambam here in Hilchot Tefillin, chapter 4, Imsach harizu aveira v'tzarich levarech bracha shniya al mitzvah tefillin v'achalakach meniach shalosh. I haven't brought the whole passage of the Rambam, but he states, like Abai and Rava, who are the Batroi, the latter opinion in the Sugya D'Shmaitza, the primary discussion in Menachot, that under normal circumstances you say one bracha, and only if you end up talking after putting the first tefillin on your arm before you put it on your head, then you've made a hefsek, so you have to make a second bracha. So the Rambam and Rashi actually also on the Sugya, Rashi being prior to Tosfot, even though he's in Ashkenaz, Rashi and the Rambam both posek, both understand it, that you say one bracha altogether on the tefillin, unless there is some kind of interruption, then you say two. This pasuk again seems to be reached by identifying the Sugya D'Shmaitza, the primary halachic discussion, which is in Menachot, and ruling according to the latter opinion in that, the Batra'i. Once we've done that, as we've seen from our earlier discussion, all other opinions elsewhere in Shas, all other tangential minor discussions are deleted. They are taken out of consideration as far as halacha is concerned. And that is the ruling of Rambam. If we look up now at the Tosfot, however, which appears in the Sugya and Brachot, Daf Samach, we see something very, very interesting. We see how he approaches trying to put together these two different sugyot. Because remember, as we've seen, the Tosfot don't accept this idea of there being a major and minor sugya. It's all kador echad, it's one ball. And the sugyot are telegrammatic, they're all in contact with another, and you have to somehow reconcile these different sugyot. So where are we going to start from? Okay, so he's quoting Rashi here, which is the same as the Rambam. From the Perek HaKometz. So again, his starting point is the Sugya and Brachot, because that's where this Tosfot is written, and which says there are two Brachot. But Perek HaKometz in Menachot, which is the primary Sugya, as we saw according to the Rambam, Omar loy sach mavarech achat, sach mavarech shtayim. If you didn't talk, you didn't interrupt between the two tefillins, you only make one bracha. And you only make the second bracha of our mitzvah tefillin in a scenario in which there's an interruption. Pirush HaKuntras, the understanding of Rashi, which is the simple understanding of the Gemara, Dal shtei ha-tefillin ka'amar, meaning it's talking about both tefillin. On both tefillin together, you'd only say one bracha without, in a normal situation, if there's been no interruption, or two with an interruption. So he's attacking this opinion based on svara. Again, we're seeing now Tosfot bringing in a svara and their own logic to challenge what is the simple meaning of the Gemara. The simple meaning of the Gemara is that this discussion is on both tefillin together, because the whole passage is discussing both tefillin together. Do you make one bracha or two brachot on both tefillin as a package? And Rashi goes along with this simple meaning, and Tosa said, "No, dorchek lomar. This is a forced, far-fetched thing to say. He said it's not very logical that the Chachamim would have instituted a second bracha al mitzvah tefillin, which only exists in a scenario where you've been over and aveira and you've interrupted between the two tefillin. And there's a certain logic to that. Do we find any other brachot which you only say in a scenario when you've done an aveira, that really you're supposed to only say one bracha, la'aniach? But if you go wrong and you're mafsik and you start talking, now I've got another bracha to say, al mitzvah. So on that basis, on the basis of that svara, that logic which has been introduced to the sugya, Tosfot are willing to overturn the simple meaning of this sugya d'shmaitza. L'chein Perish Rabbeinu tamd al shel rosh shehi gemar mitzvah ve'ikat yesh ba dalet batim b'shin b'varech al mitzvah aval sach chazel b'varech shtayim al shel rosh. So he reinterprets this whole sugya of saying two brachot to be referring only to the shel rosh. That really you always say two brachot, for both tefillin together, you'll always have two brachot, like we have in the sugya and brachot. One on the shel yad one on the Shel Rosh. However, where you've interrupted between the two, you'll now say both brachot again on the Shel Rosh. The Shel Rosh, he explains again, is another svara he's bringing in. Shel Rosh is the more important tefillin. It's the Gemara Mitzvah. It's got the Dalet Batim. It's got 4 scrolls in. It's got a shin. He brings in many different things we see in other sugyot of Shas to try and justify saying that this sugya of saying 2 brachot on the tefillin is talking about only one of the tefillin. And that's an interpretation which goes away from the simple meaning of this sugya d'shmaitza in order to reconcile it with the other sugya and brachot. So what we have here is Tosfot applying, again, in terms of the svara itself, is very reasonable. It does seem unlikely that Chazal would have invented a second bracha only for people of an Aveira. But taking the sugya at face value, if you're the Rambam, you say, keep your svara out of it. Show me what the Gemara says at face value and posek according to it. And that is 1 bracha altogether on the tefillin, and the second one only if you make a hefsek. Tosfot bringing this svara and the fact you have another sugya in brachot that says 2 brachot to try and reconcile them and say no. Really, there are 2 brachot on the whole tefillin together, and if there's a hefsek, then you have an additional one. So that is one example. And running out of time, because it's Rosh Chodesh, at least for me, maybe should I do the second example quickly about whether you recite a bracha on Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. So it's a bit of a simpler example, perhaps. So we have a primary sugya, Arachin Daf Yud, which lists all of the different days of the calendar year on which Hallel is recited. It's a certain number. It's 18 days in Eretz Yisrael. It's additional 3 days in Chutz Aretz. You've got Yom Tov Sheni, and it even goes to says, what about Rosh Chodesh, the Ikri Moed? Rosh Chodesh is called a Moed. Maybe we should also say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. Lo ikdesh bo esiyat melacha. No, since Rosh Chodesh does not have a proper law preventing you from doing melacha, it's not a fully sanctified day, and therefore we do not say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh at all. This is the primary sugya. So any time you may find some sort of minhag to say Hallel, that there could only be a minhag, that can't be a binding halacha you could say a bracha on, seemingly. And this is the psak of the Rambam here, Hilchot Megillah. So places that keep 2 days of Yom Tov Chutz La'aretz have 21 days where they do the entire Hallel. Tisha Yimei Chag, Shmona Yimei Chanukah. Okay, skip on to here. Aber b'Rosh Chadashim, Kriyat Hallel Minhag ve'eino mitzvah. On Rosh Chodesh, the reciting Hallel is only a minhag. It's not a mitzvah. Minhag zeh b'tzibur. It's only done at a tzibur when the whole tzibur is davening together. And the way we show that we're not doing the full mitzvah of Hallel is that we skip certain parts. And we do not say a bracha on this Hallel because you don't say a bracha on a minhag. It seems pretty straightforward here. The Gemara, the primary source, has said you do not say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. So if there's a minhag which is generated to start reciting certain tehillim, which is effectively what Hallel is without a bracha, then you don't say a bracha on it because you're not commanded. You're not commanded to say Hallel because there's no mitzvah in the Gemara. However, Tosfot in Arachin identified 2 indications from tangential sugyot that lead them to believe that Hallel should be recited with a bracha on Rosh Chodesh. One is from a Sechet Tanit. It's a story it's an account of Rav visiting Bavel, and he saw, according to this account, that they were reciting Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. It doesn't say whether they're saying a bracha or not. Kasavar le'ef sukinu. He thought maybe he should stop them. Rav sees that they're saying Hallel, that it's against the halacha. You're not supposed to. So he thought, should I stop them? Kim the Shamad Kamedalgi, since he realized that they were skipping certain parts, they weren't doing it at a halacha, only the minhag, amar minhag of Hashem b'yadeim. So once he saw that they were not reciting Hallel properly, they were leaving out certain parts, he thought, oh, that's it. They're only doing it according to the minhag, not according to halacha. The deduction of Tosfot is mashma sherav hayas savur shelo omrim ma'aseh klal b'imkem vaday mashma omrim ma'aseh enen minhag ba'alma v'enen chava b'yudchet yamim mikol makom. So the deduction made here and elsewhere in the Tosfot is that Rav would only have wanted to stop them from reciting Hallel if it had been done with a bracha. If it's not been done with a bracha, why would he stop them? So based on that, and another sugya in brachot, which we're not going to get time to go to now, which talks about interruptions that are made during Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, Tosfot understands that there was a certain minhag, a certain practice to recite Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. And Mikol Mokom, Omer Rabbeinu Tam, Tzorich Levarech Alav. You are required to recite a bracha on Hallel. Tekach mashma haftasov alav sukinhu shemavarachin alav. The fact that Rav was about to step in and say, "Stop! You're breaking halacha," implied shemavarachin alav. They were making a bracha on it. Miyad shara Rav shelo baruch lefanav miyad hayachol levin shelo hayachova el minhag. If he saw they were making a bracha over at the beginning, he would have seen straight away it was a minhag. So what do we have here? To summarize, we've got a primary sugya in Erechin, the Mishnah, which says straight off, these are the days you say Hallel, 18 or 21 days, and it explicitly says Rosh Chodesh no. And that's the sugya the Shmaitza, the primary discussion. So according to Rambam's rules, everything else is deleted. Nothing else matters. Everything else is outside the framework and the parameters when you're determining halacha. You have two other sources from which the Tosafot deduce, and again, not all commentaries agree with these deductions, we'll put that aside. Two other sources, one's an account of Rav visiting Bovel, another is a discussion about interruptions during Hallel. Two other sources from tangential Talmudic passages, which are taken to mean that Hallel was said with a bracha. And Rabbeinu Tam was willing, on the account of these two tangential passages, to overturn the primary passage in Erechin. And we're not going to go through the run here, which is also interesting in its own right. He connects this to a greater discussion over whether bracha is made on a minhag, because there's a general ruling which is consistent throughout the works of the Rambam, and it's also Rashi as well, being pre-Tosfot, that you never make a bracha on a minhag, and that seems to come out of the Gemara in Sukkot, that you don't say a bracha when you hit the Arava on Hoshana Rabbah, because that's a minhag, and you don't make a bracha on a minhag. And on this basis, we find Rashi students say that he actually publicly objected to saying bracha on Hallel in his community. But anyway, what we have here is that the Tosfot, in order to explain their ruling that you say a bracha on Hallel and Rosh Chodesh, even though it's a minhag, they had to come up with a whole new innovative way of distinguishing between different types of minhag. Minhag de chashuv, like saying Hallel and Rosh Chodesh, because that's some type of praise for God. And minhag which is not chashuv, like hitting an arava on the ground, which even though is a minhag apparently from the Nevi'im. And again, this leads to a whole new pilpul in its own right, how you categorize each minhag. Is it chashuv, is it not chashuv? None of it has any reference to it explicitly in the Gemara itself. And the Ram sort of points out that the Rambam here has a simplicity, both in terms of his ruling, he's following the sugya the Shmaitza on terms of Hallel, that you don't say, I've got the primary sugya saying you don't say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, and he has a simple ruling, he can stick to his ruling that you never say a bracha on a minhag, whereas the Tosafot have to start reconciling and building whole edifices of analysis and new principles to try and justify which minhagim do justify a bracha and which do not. So I'm going to leave it here, a couple of minutes over time. Are there any questions at this stage? Next week we're going to take one big case study which goes through many of these principles, and will also show how Rambam is understood in the modern yeshiva world, particularly the Bris methodology, as having adopted the Tosafot's approach to things, and how he's often misunderstood, really, when people adopt this methodology. So, any questions at this stage?
Thank you, Rav. That was beautifully presented. If anyone has any questions, they can simply unmute or write in the chat box, raise their hands. Alan.
Yes, thank you for a very clear presentation. I just wanted to ask you if there were any implications, as far as you could see, from these two different methodologies, as far as the question of stringency and leniency is concerned. Certainly in the examples that you gave us, it appeared that the methodologies of the Tosafot did add additional obligations. But is that something that you see as a general pattern in these two different types of methodology?
I'm not sure that I do. It's an issue. I bring about 30 case studies in one of the appendices of my book. I haven't really tracked through them to see which are more lenient, which are stricter. One thing which does stand out, which we find happens here in the Hallel case, is that the Tosafot will often try at the same time as pooling together different sources. They'll do it in a way which tries to justify their tradition, their minhag. So they had a minhag of saying brachot over on Hallel, whereas Rashi objected to the minhag, saying it's not the clear meaning of the Talmud. The Tosafot tried to reconcile the sugiyot in a way which justified it. So I do see that. I'm not sure I see it in terms. I think it goes both ways, just off the top of my head, but it does tend more one way or the other. But yeah, so it's a good question. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Wishing everyone a Chodesh Tov. It's probably maybe a Chodesh for more people now than it was when we started. And yeah, hope to see you all back next week for the big case study, which yeah, I think is going to be very, very interesting.
Thank you so much, Chacham. Thank you everyone for the Tov, and hopefully we can see you all in the second installment. Tov.
Thanks.